Hey guys, it's Eric from AmigaLove.com. Welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, I mainly explore niche topics that involve either the Amiga or Commodore 64 and 128 machines and their software. Now, some of you that have been following this channel for a while have probably noticed that in the past 2 years, I've really focused on the C128 and GEOS, and there's a reason for that. In August of 2022, one of my closest friends in the retro community tragically died, and his sudden absence from my life really hit me hard. His name was Chris Brenner, and he lived in Sacramento, California. Now, we communicated online daily and oftentimes for hours on end, just chatting, just getting to know one another, and working on tons and tons of really cool retro projects. So when he became completely silent, it was deafening. And it was soon afterwards that I discovered he had a terrible accident. And his death kind of put me in a little bit of a tailspin, just being completely honest. A few months later, in early 2023, both of my parents passed away separately, about 2 months apart. And so with those three tragic events all occurring relatively quickly in my mind, I ran as fast as I could to where my safety zone was, which is the C64 and the 8-bit Commodore scene, which is where I grew up when I was a kid. I'm finally ready to refocus on Amiga again and have a lot of fun there with you guys. But there's one last thing that I feel I need to do, and that is to demonstrate Chris's brilliance as an engineer and a designer with a product he created before he died, but he never sold. And I want to opine a little bit about what might have been, and it's the MMDC Retro Player. The MMDC Retro Player, I'm just going to call it MMDC, is a pixel-perfect Atari 2600 emulator that he designed in a form factor that looks like an original Sony Walkman, the cassette type with the little door that pops open. Now, this doesn't take cassette tapes or CDs, but it can use physical Atari cartridges, and all of the controls that you would expect to find on the Atari, they are represented in this Walkman form factor, which is just really, really amazing. Now, to my knowledge, there are only 4 of these complete and fully working MMDC Retro Players in existence, and one was sent to Metal Jesus Rocks, based in Washington State. A second went to one of Chris's online gaming buddies in Colorado. And the third went to his sole surviving relative, a nephew who lives in Oregon. And then I have the 4th, which Chris actually used in his house, connected to his television in his living room. Each of the 4 consoles he made seem to have subtle differences between each other, especially around the buttons. Mine don't have any labels, for example, but I know some of the other devices did have labels on the buttons. We'll take a deeper dive into all the features here in just a minute. And I know you're going to love what you see. But the truth is, this is kind of funny. No one actually knows what MMDC stands for. Like, it might mean something like, I don't know, mini multimedia desktop console. Or, I don't know, just come up with various words that seem like they might make sense. At the end of the day, though, it doesn't really matter. The MMDC is what he named it. It's what he talked about. He just never told anybody what it actually stood for, and there's nothing written down anywhere that I've been able to find that that describes it. But while the whole concept is really cool and kind of mind-blowing, Chris actually took things much further than what we're going to look at here today. He was on a path to taking things to a much higher level, which is kind of incredible. And I think part of what I'm going to show you today has never actually been demonstrated anywhere online in any form or fashion before. So hold on to your seats for that. I think you're going to love it. The truth is, he started working on this way back in 2010. And the first time he even mentioned it online was in 2016 when he revealed it to the Atari Age forum. And this is what Chris actually said. These were his words. Now, this is him explaining why he could never actually build these things and sell them to the public. If I were to do a production run of 100 units, then the retail price would be $769.50 per unit. For a run of 1,000 units, the retail price would be $384.75 per unit. The retail price includes what I think is a fair markup over the manufacturing cost. So here's the problem. I could probably find 100 people who would want to buy one of these, but probably none of them would want to pay the $770 retail price. Interesting side note here, this retail price is almost exactly the same as the retail price adjusted for inflation of the Atari VCS when it was released in 1977. The problem is even worse when trying to make a case for a production run of 1,000 units. The market probably isn't that big, so I wouldn't be able to sell all of them, and would end up losing a lot of money. Then there are the legal issues to contend with. So in 2025, with the incredible advancements and cost reductions in FPGA technology, I can't help but think that if Chris were still with us, he'd have redesigned the internals of the MMDC and produced something much more economical. But that said, the case and physical buttons may still be pretty cost prohibitive. And when I tell you what else he added to the MMDC back in 2022 before he died, I know it's going to make some of you lean forward. And then what he was planning on morphing it into after that. Chris was a computer engineer by trade, so he could do both hardware and software. But the job he had for the last 10 years before he retired was very hardware-oriented. He'd been a Commodore and Macintosh fan since their beginnings, and, quote, knew them all, inside and out. He was also a single bachelor with a lot of time on his hands. I was deeply obsessed with my Amiga 1000 and some very obscure hardware made in the mid-1980s by a company in Richardson, Texas called Microbotics. In 1986, they released a really cool side expansion called the Starboard 2 that could be configured and upgraded in powerful ways for the fledgling Amiga computer. The Starboard 2 offered up to a whopping 2 megabytes of auto-configuring zero-weight state fast RAM, and it came housed in a beautifully designed, substantial and solid metal housing, painted to closely match the Amiga's case color. And best of all, it sported smooth, rounded corners, a near match to the Amiga case, as well as the Amiga 1010 external floppy drive's design language. Just gorgeous and thoughtful. And like I mentioned before, the Starboard 2 was expandable, so not only could you attach a second Starboard onto the first one, giving you a mind-blowing potential of over 4 megabytes of fast RAM, which back in the day was ridiculous, but it had 2 internal optional upgrades to further extend your Amiga 1000's capabilities. Option 1, the multi-function module, gave you a 68881 at 14 MHz and a battery-backed-up clock. It also had this interesting sticky disk feature, which provided a rebootable RAM disk. Option 2, with the badass name of the StarDrive, gave you a SCSI controller along with an external SCSI port. Both also came with a battery-backed-up clock, powered with a single AAA battery. Now, while I was struggling to get the StarDrive working with an external iAmiga zip drive, which I eventually did get to work with the help of some others, along the way I lamented how the StarDrive's clock, naturally called Startime, only worked between the years 1979 and 2010, so essentially it was useless, even though it was a really cool potential feature. In late 2020, Chris Brenner contacted me for the very first time and asked if I wanted my Startime clock fixed. He'd written a program to make the clock's calendar last until 2058. From there, our communications and friendship grew to heights I never thought possible with somebody I'd not met in person. In early 2021, we began to collaborate on more Amiga projects. And what I mean by that is he'd do all the work, and I'd basically do some testing and then talk about it to the community. By February of 2021, Chris had completely reverse-engineered the Microbotics Starboard 2 hardware, previously a unicorn unobtainium piece of hardware. He named his version the R2, and I drew the workbench icon for him based on the updated name. On April 22nd, 2021, after my encouragement to move to SD cards, Chris wrote brand new drivers for the Starboard to use SCSI to SD boards. He wrote the drivers to package the StarTime fix as well as a new, very cool auto-booting feature. See, the Starboard still needs to boot one time from the Kickbench floppy on power-up, but after that it boots directly from the hard drive on every reset in about 20 seconds instead of over 40. This was all possible with his new driver because he could now use HD Toolbox to create a rigid disk block with all the partition information on the hard drive. It took him a few weeks to do, but the end result felt completely magical to me at the time. Now keep in mind the original Parcero was being developed by David Dunkley in Colorado at the exact same time, and Chris and David corresponded and discussed Amiga hardware, by the way. So both projects were happening simultaneously. The Amiga 1000 was experiencing what seemed like a new golden age of attention by some of the best hardware minds on the planet, especially if you consider that the Rejuvenator came back to life after many years of being unobtainium as well, around the same time frame. On May 29th, we revealed his finished project of the Microbotics Starboard R2 having been successfully reverse engineered, and he sold a couple of them. To this day, I still use that setup. And in 2025, just a couple of months ago, Joe Burks in Seattle of OtterX fame recreated the R2 PCB. Earlier that month, Chris had also begun work on Disk Mimic, which lets users of Amiga OS 1.3 mount and unmount ADF files stored on our hard drives. It was released on June 29th, 2021, just a few weeks later. He was really on a roll at this point. By the end of 2021, we'd moved our attention to Amax, a stunningly innovative and well-crafted Macintosh OS port to Amiga hardware. And Chris updated his StarDrive drivers yet again so that we could install Amax to a partition on our SCSI to SD cards, rather than use the Mac Plus emulator via floppy disk, which is what most people wind up doing, and it's fine, but it's not nearly as cool as when you're running it off a hard drive, which a lot of Macintosh software prefers to be installed on. And frankly, using my Amiga 1000 like this was a total game changer for me and expanded my Amiga's potential further than I ever thought possible. In fact, my Mac Plus was likely one of the fastest and most capable ever assembled, as I could use my Amiga's ICD add speed 14 MHz accelerator and push the RAM further than the Mac Plus was originally intended to go. It was a dream come true that really blew my mind. Having been a C64 guy growing up and using Macintoshes starting my sophomore year in high school while I was working on the school newspaper. After the Amax project, Chris started to play around with software again and created an HD install for the NTSC version of Pinball Dreams. Using the WHD load installer, it worked great under OS 1.3 using the latest JST binary, and was less finicky than the HD install made from the JST installer. He soon went on to create an OS 1.3 workbench decoration for Christmas. He would get really nostalgic about the Christmas season. In July of 2022, Chris created what he called the Slam board. This was 8 megabytes of modern fast RAM specifically designed for use with his reverse-engineered Microbotics Starboard 2 StarDrive R2. My gosh, that's a mouthful. The idea was to take advantage of the pass-through port on the original Starboard and provide Amiga 1000s with up to 8 megabytes of modern SD RAM, similar to what David Dunkley's Parcero provided. I sneaked mine inside a spare Microbotics Starboard case and designed a Slam logo for it in the spirit of the original Microbotics decals. Chris thought it was hilarious and really loved the idea. His Slam board, though, simply sat bare and was attached to the outside of his Soul Starboard 2. So now back to the MMDC. Let's take a little bit of a deeper dive into what this thing looks like and how it works. I never actually saw an MMDC Retro Player in person while Chris was alive. He mentioned it a few times as something he was proud of having done. He also mentioned his work on the original Digimaster software from 1993, which allows us to process shockingly good digital audio on our Commodore 64s.
Can't touch this.
I discovered after he was gone that it had been written about in Commodore world in the 90s. One of those eye-widening moments, and then the wave of regret I'd not dug into it deeper when he was around. I first ever saw the MMDC when I flew to Sacramento to attend the funeral and to help Chris's nephew sort through his things to be sold at an Amiga event to help pay for the funeral bills. As I created piles and put suggested prices on things like his amazing Amiga 4000, I found the MMDC in his living room attached to his television. But what I found next really shocked me. First, the MMDC had been upgraded. A strange board-like thing was sticking out of the cartridge port with cables protruding from the plastic. So guys, this is that weird cartridge I was talking about that had cables sticking out the side of it. One is a PS2 cable, and the other an IEC, right? So for like peripherals, maybe a disk drive or a printer, and then potentially like a tape drive, perhaps? And you put this in like an Atari cartridge. Now this is really cool. This guy right here can basically hold up to 4 cores. Right, the default is the Atari 2600, so if you don't do anything, that's what it's going to do when you press play, which is this button. If you do game select, that's going to be the next slot. If you do reset, that's the next slot. And if you do down here, if you do pause, that's a 4th slot. So technically you can hold up to 4, but the default is Atari 2600, so I like to think of it as like 3 additional. So what does that mean? What that means is if you turn this on, and then immediately press and hold this button, within the first 2 seconds, you get a Commodore 64. Now, this looks a little strange, but it's because, like a Mister, it has resolution settings that you can provide to let it know what the screens are that you're connecting it to. These are still the defaults that were set up with Chris's television. So this is some sort of resolution that his TV was set to when I found the MMDC in his house. So let's turn this off by pressing stop. And he has in the second core another Commodore 64 in a different resolution. And I'm not sure if it shows up in the video very well, but he also has scan lines turned on. So he has some visual effects that he can play with here, which is really, really cool. I'll turn that off again. And this time I'm going to do the final core. And it's Mr. Do Arcade ROM. I mean, guys, how freaking cool is this? And of course, he had a bunch of other games that you could play, that you could install. He had tools. He has tools that you can use to change the cores that you want to run, like Galaga Arcade. He had Pac-Man and Miss Pac-Man Arcade, just all kinds of really all in one package. Now, you're probably wondering, what the heck is this thing for? Well, he made it so that it could use a really inexpensive keyboard. This is like 20 bucks on Amazon, right? Plug this in. I'll go back to the Commodore 64, press play. And now I can type. I'm going to say, hello, everybody. MMDC Commodore 64. But it doesn't stop there. Around the beginning of 2022, with the AMAX project fully behind us, I remember Chris asking me one night if there was anything else I wish I had for my Amiga 1000. I'd successfully managed the Rejuvenator project at the end of 2021, and the StarDrive and the AMAX projects had really been tremendous wins. I responded, I wish there had been a Commodore 64 AMAX type of product. There'd been all these attempts to emulate the Commodore 64 on the Amiga, and they were either really lame or really resource hungry. AMAX was an amazing product, far better than I could have ever imagined once you wrote the driver to support the StarDrive. I wish we had a hardware and software solution that could plug into our Amiga the same way. Chris just listened, and the topic soon changed to the next thing, as it so often did. When I was standing in Chris's house, I eventually walked over to his Amiga 1000, and to my utter astonishment, a bare MMDC PCB was plugged into his Amiga. I think one port was plugged into the second joystick port. I'm not kidding. And the other may have been the serial port. I fired up his Amiga 1000, but I couldn't find any obvious programs that sounded like a C64 emulator in the works. That said, I didn't go digging through the CLI in every single drawer. I was looking for icons, which in hindsight is kind of stupid. He was a programmer. He would have been writing things just in, raw files. My time was limited though, and so I wasn't going to buy the Amiga 1000 either. I did, however, put the modified MMDC board in the pile I planned to pay for. I also moved Chris's personal Starboard 2 StarDrive R2 over to my pile. To this day, I've not hooked any of it up again to try and dig through his stuff, because frankly, it very likely not finished, not complete, and it's just too painful, But as time goes on, I do sometimes get briefly curious, and then my head gets kind of heavy, and I jump to some other thoughts and move on. Chris's dev machine was an old cheese grater, obsolete Power Mac, right, that he jailbroke in some way so that he could actually install modern Macintosh OSs on it anyway, because it was still capable of running them amazingly. But I never had access to that machine. And so all of his work and files, for all intents and purposes, are lost. But to think, we were so close. I know he would have figured it out, and I am certain he was excited to surprise me with the prototype MMDC 64, allowing us to transform our Amigas into Commodore 64 machines and use IEC devices and more. He loved Commodore, and he was brilliant enough to do it all. So guys, that's the MMDC and the totally intense and inspirational friendship that I had with one of the smartest people I've ever known, period. And here's to Chris Brenner and to all the other people out in the scene that devote precious amounts of time from their lives so that we can enjoy the fruits of their labor. Thank you so much to all of you out there that do this. I really miss Chris deeply still to this day, but I'm ready to jump back into Amiga. I know he would have liked that at the end of the day as well, so I'm ready to get that journey started again. So remember, guys, keep that Amiga love flowing, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Amiga love.